Samsung is the largest company in South Korea, accounting for more than 20% of the major economy's total GDP. It pulled this off by making everything. We're talking smartphones and washing machines to military equipment and the world's largest ships. The company employs so many people and is responsible for so much of South Korea's way of life that some consider the secretive family at the top to be like a reincarnated royal dynasty. What's even more shocking than the sheer breadth and power of this formidable conglomerate is its humble beginnings. Less than 70 years ago, Samsung was a tiny family-run fish trader. Now, it's bigger than most countries. So how did it go from being a small fish in a big pond to owning the pond? The secret is surprisingly simple. Chapter 1. New Boss, Old Boss. Samsung's founder was Lee Byung-chul. He was born on the 12th of February 1920 to a wealthy landowning family, but the silver spoon in his mouth wasn't going to make life any easier for him. Korea was on the verge of seismic change. Instability was about to rock its foundations. Lee's family status among the ruling class was about to become a target on his back. That's because just a few months after his birth, Japan officially annexed Korea as part of its colonialist agenda. This included forced cultural integration, unequal treatment of Koreans, plus a whole bunch of economic hardship and oppression. But the Japanese Empire's ambitions couldn't be achieved alone. Lee's family were a part of the Yongbang clan, a gentry composed of civil servants, military officers, and aristocrats. Think of them like the equivalent of Europe's knights and lords or Japan's shoguns and samurai. Nowadays, Yongbang is a bit of a jokey insult in Korea. Imagine an unemployed 40-year-old neckbeard sipping energy drinks in his mother's basement while she washes his laundry. You might think this life is good, but on the outside, it's clearly not. He's a Yongbang. Yet the name used to command respect because these scholarly types guided Korea for hundreds of years. That's probably why they were perfect candidates to be Japan's cronies. Even though the Yongbang dynasty ended in 1897, enough descendants were still in influential positions by the annexation of 1910. The Yongbang, who assimilated with Japanese rule, got to keep their wealth and power. Those who didn't had their Confucian ways of life squeezed out by Japan's push for modernization. It was a classic case of adapt or die. This philosophy for survival became the backdrop of Lee's formative years, even if he didn't know it at the time. But by 1938, he'd put that talent for adaptability into action when he dropped out of college and moved to a neighboring province. Here, he set up his own company called, well, you know the name. You're watching this video, aren't you? Samsung roughly translates to 3 stars. Each star represents tenets of the company: greatness, prosperity, and longevity. At the time, you could fault him for being arrogant. I mean, greatness is a good aspiration for any local grocery trader. But are dried fish really prosperous? Well, Lee was doing something right. He had 40 employees under his belt, all working together to deal in noodles and locally grown groceries. Initial customers were based in Korea, but soon he was exporting to China. By the time the 35-year-old Japanese rule of Korea ended in 1945, there were new business opportunities to be found. While Japan was being rebuilt with the help of the Allied forces, Korea had its own identity crisis. In just a few years, Lee would be able to redefine the identity and nature of his own company. In 1947, the Samsung company was doing so well that Lee could uproot his HQ to Seoul, where all the big fish were, as in other companies, not fish for selling. In less than a decade, he was living up to the first 2 stars of his company's name: greatness and prosperity. But the 3rd star of longevity would require a new way of thinking. So it's time to learn how history works as we dissect how Samsung went from selling fish to controlling a country. This week's video is sponsored by Trade Coffee. Trade is one of my favorite ways to explore the world through something I love: a nice cup of joe. Trade makes Java exciting, connecting me with over 450 coffees from over 55 local roasters, including dark roasts, espressos, blends, and rare roasts. Their matching algorithm curates the perfect coffee match for you based on your taste preferences and surprises you with a new variety every time. It knew I liked medium light roasted coffees with flavors of berries, chocolates, and nuts, so it matched me with Familia from Pejoto, and I get to experience Brazilian coffee. I used to drink coffee just as a way to get me going, but when I started tasting good coffee with Trade, I realized that you shouldn't sacrifice taste just for energy, and I'm never going back to that disgusting old coffee. Fresh coffee is better coffee, and the coffee will always be shipped within 48 hours of being roasted. Trade is so confident you'll love your experience, they're offering 30% off when you subscribe. Visit drinktrade.com/howhistoryworks to subscribe and save 30% off on your first order. With free shipping, customizable plans, and anytime cancellation, Trade is making it easier to discover better coffee. Chapter 2. Big Fish, Small Ponds. 1950 was the year North Korea invaded South Korea, although North Korea swears that's not what happened. Nonetheless, the fight to claim Korea's true statehood was underway. The US and UN forces backed the South, while the North was helped by the Soviet Union and China. Before, Lee was caught between Japan and Korea. Now he was caught between Korea and China. Things heated up even more when his adopted home of Seoul became the base of operations for the South's war effort. At one point, the South almost lost, and it looked like Lee's company would be taken out by the North's communist agenda. However, the North Korean army was repelled with the help of the United Nations Command. Lee moved the head office out of Seoul, which was good timing. In January 1951, the communist forces captured the city. What followed was a 2-year war of attrition between the two sides of the conflict. Meanwhile, Lee had already pivoted to survive in the changing landscape by setting up a sugar refinery. Lee's company adapted around the shifts in political power, the physical and ideological borders between his consumer base, and the pendulum swings of history. Combat stopped on the 27th of July, 1953, with the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement. Technically, the war is still ongoing. No peace treaty was ever signed. The Korean War displaced millions of people and had the highest rate of civilian casualties amongst all modern conflicts. By the time the armistice was signed, the peninsula had lost between 12 to 15% of its population. Almost all of Korea's major cities had been destroyed. But for all intents and purposes, life in South Korea became peaceful. Or at least, it could start to be peaceful. In the wake of 1953, Korea needed to be rebuilt again, just like how Japan needed to be rebuilt after the end of World War II. The future was a blank slate, but to a business mind like Lee, it was a goldmine. The world had already seen Japan utilize business to rebuild infrastructure and reignite its economy. So when Korea was gathering up for the same thing, Lee jumped at the chance to help out. His next moves could put Samsung on track for success. Thankfully, he already had a track record for adaptation. Post-war Korea was in dire need of infrastructure. Everything from food and water to iron and coal needed a pipeline. So, to reinvigorate the country, the new Korean government introduced protectionist policies to help establish large domestic conglomerates, aka chaebol. These companies were typically family-run and shielded from competition or given easier financing to get them up and running. Think of it like state-sponsored capitalism, where everyone got $200 every time they passed go. Lee capitalized on these, pun intended, by moving into the textile industry and setting up the largest wool mill in the country. This way, Samsung grew along with its country, or at least, that was the theory. Chapter 3. Survival Instincts. Having an ear to the ground would have helped Samsung respond to the direction of the country, but progress was slower than a glacier going uphill. Nonetheless, Lee found ways to diversify his company's portfolio. As the 1960s approached, Lee snapped up 3 of Korea's largest commercial banks, plus insurance firms and businesses which specialize in cement and fertilizers. In Monopoly board terms, this was like maxing out the red and orange set. Statistically, those are the best spaces to get on the game, though I know some people in the comments will swear the brown spaces are the true key to success. The point is, Lee positioned his company to be the go-to guy for development. If you wanted to set up a business, you needed capital and protection. If you wanted to create a farm or build something, you needed construction materials and agricultural ingredients. Life may have been good for Samsung, but Korea wasn't doing so hot. The government was unstable and corrupt, and economic difficulties were a constant source of irritation amongst the people. People viewed this post-war government as being an old boys club where traditionalists and elites didn't serve the people. In some sense, you could say they were like the new form of the Yongbon. This came to a halt in 1961 with a military coup on May 16th, known as, well, the May 16 coup. Park Chung-hee and his allies pulled off the takeover, and laid the foundations for the rapid industrialization of South Korea. The way they saw it, they'd already lost a vital decade of growth to previous government failings, which was why South Korea basically had the same GDP as its enemy over the northern border. One directive to compensate for lost time was to overhaul economic and commercial policies. You can imagine Park Chung-hee wasn't too fond of a Yongbon descendant owning so many banks. Lee was in Japan at the time, or perhaps left for Japan shortly after the coup. The exact details are a bit hazy. But what is known is that he didn't return to South Korea until a new deal had been struck with its government. Once he'd agreed to give up control of the banks and follow other new policies, Lee was able to return home. So far, he'd been raised in the shadow of Korea's elite, got caught up in Japan's meddling, then sold fish to China. Later, China backed North Korea. When North Korea was defeated, Lee helped rebuild South Korea, only for the South Korean government to be hounded out by rebels, the same rebels which caused him to hide in Japan. You can imagine that the middle-aged businessman was yearning for some peace and quiet. But the first thing he did in the wake of the coup was to set up the Federation of Korean Industries. Think of this as a lobby group for conglomerates that advocates for free market policies and private sector redevelopment. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The new Korean government had redrawn the economic roadmap, and Lee had a new terrain to adapt to. If he played his cards right, he could bring Samsung to the top of the corporate food chain forever. Chapter 4. Go forth and multiply. Without the banks as a money spinner, Lee overhauled his cornerstone textile company into a vertically integrated backbone for his business. He purchased an oil refinery, a nylon manufacturer, and even a department store. In case it's not obvious, he had stopped trading dried fish by now. Not only was he poised to take advantage of Korea's incoming consumer boom, he was poised to take advantage of Korea's national growth. The latter half of the 20th century saw South Korea go from a least developed country to a developed one. By the time the 1990s wrapped up, child mortality rates had plummeted, national GDP had skyrocketed, and the nation's capital had hosted the Olympic Games. Historians refer to this period as the Miracle of the Han River, as a tongue-in-cheek nod to the West Germany's Miracle of the Rhine. It basically means a miraculous post-war economic boom, and has since gone on to become the model of growth for developing nations. As you can imagine, credit for this direction is debated. Some say Park Chung-chee's dictatorship was the main cause, but others say Samsung is to thank for saving the country. In the lead up to the stellar growth, Lee spent the 70s setting up Samsung Heavy Industries to cater to military customers, and Samsung Shipbuilding to attract partners in the import-export hustle. In 1977, Samsung Precision Company was created for engineering and manufacturing projects, such as security systems, industrial machinery, and cameras. As the 70s wound down, South Korea's economic improvements encouraged the government to back heavy industries. On top of that, Lee was starting to realize that the key to adaptation wasn't understanding your environment. It was about creating the environment. Samsung invested heavily into chemical and petrochemical industries in anticipation of a world driven by a technological way of life. Samsung had already started to enter the tech space. Back in 1969, Samsung Electronics was established to produce black and white televisions, air conditioners, and calculators. To an outsider, these businesses were too diverse. Cargo ships and calculators? How are these going to work together? In reality, Lee was strategically gaining footholds in complementary emerging markets. Think of it like a butterfly. Some evolve wings to appear like the faces of bigger predators. That way they ward off a hungry neighbor. But Lee's butterfly was trying to evolve wings to look like a new predator. After all, the aim of the game is survival, so you need to brace yourself for the future as much as you need to get through today. So Samsung doubled down on this gamble by investing more into research and development through the 70s. Tech was still a few years away from Sony and Microsoft. Computers and electronics weren't cool or consumer-friendly, so Lee's interest in propping up this experimental sector had to be carefully coordinated. His inroads into owning a telecommunications company helped boost sales of his televisions, and his various electronics-related divisions got Samsung into the semiconductor market, which meant he could generate cash flow with B2B projects. As the 1980s rolled in, Samsung acquired more telecommunications hardware companies to buttress itself against competitors. If you've seen Wall Street, then you'll remember Gordon Gekko's lunchbox-sized cell phone. Maybe you've seen archive footage of the revolutionary fax machines. Think of any piece of equipment that was a staple of office life and it'll likely have Samsung's logo on it. In the same way Lee pivoted from infrastructure of groceries into infrastructure of nations, now he was pivoting to be part of infrastructure for business. But things weren't going to last forever. President Park Chung-hee eventually limited the number of news outlets, which meant Samsung lost its broadcasting output. On top of that, the Federation of Korean Industries had come under scrutiny for its ties with rebels and allegedly prioritizing their personal business concerns over societal ones. Can you imagine a clan of corporations putting profit over people? Unthinkable. And then, to make matters worse for Lee, just as economic growth was nearing its peak, just as all his businesses were running smoothly and it looked like he'd skirt the building criticism, he'd keel over and died. There's nothing like death to inconvenience your business plans. He was 77 years old when he passed away on November 19, 1987. But what's the point of evolving to survive if you don't have any descendants? Lee's third son took over the empire and began the transition of the Samsung we love and hate today. Chapter 5. Same but different. Samsung has businesses in hospitality, lithium-ion batteries, credit cards, biotechnology, and theme parks. Its construction branch was contracted for Taipei 101 in Taiwan and Burj Khalifa in the United Arab Emirates. At this point in time, Samsung's connections are so vast that it'd be simpler to list the things they don't do. But why even bother doing that when we can focus on what they are known for today: consumer computer technology and getting arrested? In 1993, new Samsung head honcho Lee Kun-hee took his father's empire in a new direction. He sold off subsidiaries and downsized the company to narrow its focus on three key industries: electronics, engineering, and chemical, the pillars of any technology-dependent civilization. From here, Samsung refined its tech to become a leader in screens, televisions, computer components, and of course, smart devices. Say what you will about Android's emojis, they had wireless charging and multitasking while iPhone was still figuring out copy and paste. Since the turn of the millennium, Samsung snowballed into an undisputed global force. Wherever you go, Samsung is trusted as a brand and idolized as an employer, but the family running the show is viewed more cynically. They influence tech, commerce, and politics so much that there are some Koreans who view the dynasty as reincarnated monarchs. That might sound ridiculous to us because America doesn't have a monarchy, but we do have royalty. It's just our royalty is nowhere near as respected. Nouveau riche celebs like Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton are envied but ridiculed. Family dynasties like the Kennedys and the Trumps are unifying but cult-like. Even our messianic tech CEOs like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk are not as respected as the Samsung clan. How else do you explain the non-issue of the CEO embezzling money for the former South Korean president? Well, I say non-issue. It was a big deal back in 1996 when it came to light that he helped a president illegally amass hundreds of millions of dollars. But it was brushed under the rug twice. First with a suspended sentence of 3 years, and next with a formal pardon from the new president. To most business magnates, that would have been career-ending. Instead, Lee carried on working and was even celebrated for his contributions to business and international relations. But then, in 2007, a former Samsung chief lawyer spilled the beans on Samsung's under-the-table dealings. Lee Kun-hee had a whole line of lawyers trained to take the fall for any scandal that might come his way. It was even normal for his team to fabricate evidence when they needed to protect the Samsung leader. It also turned out Samsung had illegally opened up thousands of bank accounts under its executives' names. The chief lawyer even lifted the lid on an attempt to bribe the US federal district court judge who was presiding over a case of Samsung executives accused of price-fixing memory chips. Police raided Lee's home and office. A few months later, he was found guilty of a litany of, shall we say, financial misbehavior. He resigned, got fined, and received a suspended sentence, which again was overturned with another presidential pardon. After that, he returned to Samsung having learned his lesson. Until 2017 that was, when he was convicted yet again. This time for bribing former President Park Geun-hye to grease the wheels of the government in favor of his business merger. Want to know what happened next? You guessed it, a presidential pardon. Lee kicked the bucket on the 25th of October 2020, and his only son took the reins in 2022. As for the other members of the Samsung family, they operate other divisions, and are equally protected by layers of wealth, lawyers, and admiring public. It seems no matter what Samsung does, it will always be a family-run empire that can use political connections and industry to get what it wants. In some ways, this is the logical end to its founder's ethos. When Lee Kun-hee was born in the ruins of the Yongbon, he was told he'd have to adapt to the new way of life if he wanted to have any influence. He went from providing infrastructure to locals, government, and business. After his death, his machine went on to provide infrastructure for culture. Samsung is such a fixture in our modern, interconnected, tech-heavy world that it's hard to imagine a life without them. Heck, it's impossible to imagine Korea without Samsung. At this point, Samsung and Korea are pretty much the same thing. But you tell us, is Samsung just the Yongbon of old, or does globalization always lead to new dynasties? Let us know in the comments below. If you like this video, make sure to check out our video on the history of the first hedge fund to keep on learning how history works.